too. If you have somebody exercising in the heat, the stress of that heat is going to affect cardiovascular stress, right? It's going to affect how hard it is for them to do. And so we'll see things like increased heart rate. We're going to see increased rating of perceived exertion as a byproduct of those changes in environment. So we can't always use the method, or we can't always force people to use it under certain circumstances. All right, so a little bit more, or maybe I should say a lot more applicable way to prescribe exercise intensities based off of heart rate. We know heart rate is linearly related to exercise intensity until we get to really high intensities of exercise. But generally speaking, we're confident that the heart rate exercise intensity relationship is linear through most intensities. There's 3 heart rate methods that are shared in Heyward, and ACSM uses them too. The heart rate versus METs graph, not a bad one. It still uses METs, but it's actually, it is legitimate. It's very individualized, which I like. The heart rate reserve method, and then the heart rate max method. We're going to talk about all 3 of these. So figure 5.3, this is in the Heyward text. This is the heart rate versus METs method. And so if we have the luxury, which we should in most circumstances, most testing environments, to do a submaximal exercise test on an individual, and we obtain steady state heart rates throughout a range of exercise intensities, we can graph that. And so on this graph, we have on the y-axis, we have heart rate. On the x-axis, we have METs. And so if we have an individual that we determine, hey, we want you to be in a 60 to 85% VO2 reserve or MET reserve zone, we can look at their specific data and go, hey, what were your heart rates when you're at whatever METs we determined to be at 60%, whatever METs we determined to be at 85%, and then we can use those heart rates for when you actually exercise. So in this case, an individual obviously did an exercise test when they were at that 60% VO2 reserve zone or METs, which would be right about here, right? So about 4.8 METs. We can take a look up and see what their heart rate was, and their heart rate happened to be 139. Congratulations. And then we could look at that 85% of VO2 reserve or MET reserve, which looks like it was calculated to be right around 6.5 METs. And we can go up and say, yeah, your heart rate during that at that intensity was or would have been about 175. So now we've prescribed a target heart rate zone based on their actual exercise intensity, a little less based on assumptions, right? On estimations. And so using this technique is quite useful if you have the means to do it. I've used it myself. I think it is effective with clients to really get a more accurate heart rate representation of that relationship between heart rate and intensity. Not a bad technique. Probably the most common and, in my opinion, the most useful heart rate method, in part because of its simplicity, but in part because it's useful, is the heart rate reserve method, HRR, or it's often referred to as the Karvonen method. So the heart rate reserve or Karvonen method equation is there. You take someone's heart rate max minus their heart rate max at rest, multiply it by the exercise intensity you want them to be at, and then you add back heart rate rest. If this equation looks familiar, it's pretty much the same equation used for the VO2 reserve technique, but we've thrown in heart rate instead of VO2 or the MET technique, right? They all have this similar approach by coming up with a percent based on the range, the physiological range that an individual has. So from the end of resting heart rates up until max heart rates, give it a range of that heart rate zone, and then we just add resting heart rate back because, of course, no one's ever going to have a heart rate lower than resting. So heart rate reserve technique, heart rate max minus heart rate rest, multiply that by percent intensities, and then add back heart rate rest. Calculating heart rate max, yeah, heart rate max is a tricky one, and still the standard value used to estimate it is 220 minus someone's age. This estimate is probably where the biggest error comes in estimates of VO2 max when we use it as a tool to determine what someone's max VO2 should be. It also becomes a little bit of a liability in the heart rate reserve technique. But if you have a client who's at heart rate max you can't measure directly for multiple reasons, too high of an exercise intensity getting them to max, we have to rely on some sort of prediction. There is a chart, a table in ACSM that has heart rate max prediction equations that are different than 220 minus age, and they're improvements, right? People have recognized that this 220 minus age is quite inaccurate, especially for people who are on the sort of outer standard deviations from normal fitness, right? So people who are really fit or people who are less fit, that this equation doesn't do them service, right? Especially people who are really fit, 220 minus age under predicts max heart rate. People are very unfit, it may over predict it. So check out that table in Heyward. I think I reference it on another slide, but there is a table in Heyward. So using the heart rate reserve technique, once you've decided on an exercise intensity, you just apply the equation. So let's say we wanted a 20-year-old to go at a 70% heart rate reserve intensity. Their resting heart rate was 60 beats per minute. We then take 220 minus age, which was their max heart rate. So heart rate max 200 minus resting heart rate 60, multiply that by 0.7. I don't know what that gives you. And then you add back the resting heart rate, and that would give you a heart rate of 158 beats per minute. So for this 20-year-old with a 60 beat per minute resting heart rate, their heart rate reserve at 70% would be 158 beats per minute. There you have it. The heart rate max technique is quite simple. You just take someone's heart rate max and multiply it by the percent intensity that you want them exercising at. It is not the same. You do not get the same values as you do with the heart rate reserve technique. For the heart rate max technique, you need to use a higher percent of heart rate max to get the same intensity as the heart rate, or same heart rate as the heart rate reserve technique. So the heart rate max is quite simple though, right? Figure out what their max heart rate is, multiply it by that percent, and there you got the value. So at the very bottom there, 200 times 0.75. If you want someone at 75% of their heart rate max, there you go, 150 beats per minute. This is like the good mental math one, right? If you're on the fly, have to come up with something that's close. Oh yeah, we need you to about 75%. Yeah, your max heart rate's about 200, so you should be about, right? I keep using the term about. Should be at about 150 beats per minute. So it's useful. This is from Heyward, Table 5.1, comparison methods for prescribing exercise for healthy adults. This is using a couple different sort of intensity techniques. We have the heart rate reserve, VO2 reserve, we have the heart rate max, and we have RPE. If based on their fitness classification, these are the percent zones. This is a little bit different than Table 6.1 in ACSM. Table 6.1 ACSM is a very similar chart, but use the values in ACSM over this. There are slight differences, they don't always jive at Heyward and ACSM. So use ACSM as the preferred resource for these values, but this is at least a little bit less confusing chart or table than ACSM presents. So the limitations of the heart rate methods, predicting heart rate max, which we've already talked about, can lead to massive errors. It is table 6.2 in ACSM that has those other prediction equations. They're interesting. Try them out. They all come up with a similar max heart rate, but there are considerations other than age that goes into those other predictions, which sometimes makes them a lot more accurate. Heart rate max also varies with exercise mode. So somebody on a treadmill's heart rate max, what do you think? Is it going to be higher than on a bike? If you said yes, why would that be? More muscle mass? Yeah, you're on, right? So, depending on the exercise, the comfort of the client with that exercise modality, heart rate max will vary, but amount of muscle mass engaged is a typical determinant of higher heart rate maxes. And heart rate max, or heart rate in general, sorry, not just heart rate max, is affected by various factors, medications, environment, multiple things, right? And so sometimes heart rate isn't even the best way to prescribe exercise intensity. A pretty useful tool is the RPE. some of you are going, wow, how unscientific is the rating of perceived exertion scale? Yeah, you're right. It's very subjective, but if at the end of the day you want to stress your client to an intensity that feels like it's moderate exercise or vigorous exercise, getting their opinion, getting their rating of their own perceived exertion, right, of their perceived exertion, is pretty good. And so research supports this actually quite well. Now you're going, wow, so that whole VO2 reserve thing and the whole heart rate stuff, we'll just tell them to exercise until they get to an RPE of maybe a 5 to 6 on the 10-point scale for moderate and 7 to 8 for vigorous. Yes, I'm telling you that's effective. So, you know, in this world of kinesiology, exercise science, we want to be as accurate and thorough as possible. And so using science as much as we can, heart rate reserve technique, heart rate techniques, the VO2 reserve technique, all that stuff, use it, but also recognize that there is this human element, right? There is this art of prescription, and things like the RPE, quite effective. Using the 6 to 20 scale, I actually like the 6 to 20 scale personally. If we're using that, an RPE of 12 to 16 is recommended for most individuals. That's typically for moderate intensity. That does touch on the threshold of high intensity or vigorous exercise. The 6 to 20 scale, the Borg 6 to 20 RPE scale, is supposed to match up with an individual's heart rate, right? So you think most individuals' resting heart rate is close to 60, and their max is close to 200, and so they just took the zeros off. And so that 6 to 20 scale, if somebody's like at a 12 on the 6 to 20 scale, their heart rate is usually close to 120. So there is this interesting relationship with the Borg scale and max heart rate and heart rate, which I find fascinating, and I like to use it because I like to go, hey, your heart's at 140. What's your RPE? And they go, oh, 14. I'm like, oh, spot on, right? It's not always the case, but it is not a bad scale to use as an alternate to the 10-point scale. Finally, there's some other methods. One of my favorites is the talk test, and you're going, wow, even less scientific. It's like, no, excuse me, not less scientific. It's actually the talk test has some science behind it, and there's different versions. There's a counting talk test, the singing talk test. The talk test is simply this. Ask your client or have your client, while they're exercising, try and hold a conversation. Excuse me real quick. If they can talk comfortably, that's okay. If they can talk but not sing, and asking a client to sing isn't really that cool. So sometimes having them count is a different way to do it. But if they can't sing, but they can talk, that usually means exercise intensity is at a moderate intensity. If they can't talk or sing, then that usually means exercise intensity is at the vigorous level. There is some physiology behind this, right? As you know, the more vigorous exercise intensity gets, the more we have to breathe, right? And so the ventilation is directly associated with exercise intensity. At a moderate exercise intensity, we should be breathing harder, of course, compared to rest. Not so hard to where we can't have a conversation, but probably hard to where we can't sing or hold a note kind of thing, right? There's going to be certain ways of talking or having people try and communicate with you that will require kind of breath holding stuff. Singing has that control of breath. Additionally, as we get to higher exercise intensities, right, and I can't talk at all, I might even be above a threshold, right, that lactate threshold, right? The acidosis is taking over and ventilation is so strong, I can't pause in my breathing to sing or control my breath in that way. That would be a sign that exercise intensity is vigorous. The talk test, I don't personally use it as my only means. It's sort of my side means, my sort of sly way to see where somebody's at. I'll ask them their RPE. Oh yeah, I'm at 5. But if they're like, oh, I'm at a 5 and they can't do the talk test, I'm like, you're not at a 5, you're like at 8 or a 9. You're just trying to be tough, right? So the talk test is a nice tool to use, not as your only way to assess exercise intensity, but to sort of give you another tool to add on to what you've already seen to confirm or deny what you're already seeing. So check out ACSM Box 6.2. This is on page 150. It's a summary of the methods for prescribing exercise intensity. So it gets into some of the details that you should understand of how to correctly prescribe exercise intensity for different populations. All right, so getting away from exercise intensity, that's the bulk of this discussion today. Time. Yeah, how long do you have somebody exercise for? Well, 20 to 60 minutes is it, right? We've already talked about this a little bit. This is a per session type of thing. We don't always do weekly exercise. We want you at 150 minutes a week. You do want to look back at the week and see, but we don't want to start people off usually too high. So starting someone at 20 minutes per session makes sense depending on their fitness level, who they are, where they've been from, where they've come from. Multiple shorter sessions is okay for some people. If they can't do 20 minutes to start off with in one day, depending on your access to them or how competent they are, hey, do 10 minutes with us right now. We're going to get you 10 minutes on the treadmill at this heart rate. And then if you can go home and maybe you'll take your dog for a walk and I'll teach you how to measure your heart rate. See if you can get your heart rate up into that zone and maybe do a 10-minute walk this afternoon. That isn't a bad way to accumulate the total amount of time for someone's duration of exercise for your prescription. Frequency. How often do we have people exercise? Well, frequency is in reference to how many days per week or how many sessions per week. Don't always start with 5 days. We need to work up to that, right? 5 days for a lot of people is a lot, right? Some people, especially who don't exercise at all, 5 days is an insane amount. So start them low, work your way up. Frequency does vary based on certain factors. How intense is exercise going to be? What's their initial fitness level? How much time do they have, right? Not everyone has the time to exercise 5 days a week. And their preference is, hey, I don't want to exercise 5 days a week. I just want to do 3 days. Okay, let's work around that. Volume is the new piece or one of the new pieces of the FIT VP principle. Volume is that sum of frequency, intensity, and time. No product, sorry, I keep saying sum. So it's useful in estimating total amount of exercise, not just amount, but amount. There's a typo there. So we use two different tools: MET minutes per week or kcals per week are the units that we could express this exercise volume. A MET minute is METs times time. So how many METs was somebody exercising at, and how many minutes do they exercise? And we just do the math. Hey, you're at 5 METs for 20 minutes on this day. You're at 10 METs for 5 minutes on this day. You multiply them all together, and you'll get MET minutes. Kilocalories is also quite often used, probably more than MET minutes. Kilocalories is nice because people like to know how many calories they've burned from exercise. They like to try and match that up with dietary things like caloric intake. That's a whole nother can of worms, but at least understanding how many calories somebody burned, we know that there's that 1,000-calorie threshold per week to maximize the health-related outcomes of exercise, right? The positive benefits of exercise. So to calculate kilocalories burned, we take METs, exercise METs, multiply that by 3.5. We're essentially turning METs back into VO2. Multiply that by body weight in kilograms, and divide that by 1,000. And for those of you savvy with math, what we've essentially just done is converted METs into VO2 in liters per minute. And then we multiply that by 5. So when someone's exercising, if you had somebody exercising at 5 METs, you multiply 5 by 3.5, multiply that by their body weight in kgs, divide that by 1,000, and then multiply that by 5, and that will tell you how many calories they're burning per minute. And then ultimately you multiply that by time, minutes, and that gives you a number of calories burned either per session or per week. Yeah, it's pretty clean math. It's not, it's not crazy. It's basically using VO2 as a means to estimate caloric expenditure, which is something that works. So that's how we estimate volume, or that's how we use volume. A lot of programs are volume based. How much exercise are you going to do per week? That brings us to progression. How often, how vigorously do we change exercise? So progression, we have to understand firstly, as people start an exercise program, and of course it depends on where they start. The less fit individuals, we're going to see the most improvement. The most fit individuals, we're going to see the least improvement from an exercise program. There is that sort of, the closer they get to that peak of fitness, the less return they're going to get from training. So people who are unfit, yeah, that first week or two, they're going to improve dramatically. So the first, 2 months, we'll see the greatest improvement across anybody, all populations. So be mindful of that. So changes during the first 6 to 8 weeks, yeah, there should be some changes in progression of the program during that phase. The term overload is used. So we want to overload the individual exercising by manipulating duration, intensity, and frequency. Some notes. We don't want to increase more than one of those above factors, duration, intensity, or frequency, at once. In other words, you're exercising 20 minutes a day, 3 days a week, at 60% of heart rate reserve. Next week, you're ready for it. Next week, we're going to have you go for 25 minutes instead of 20, but the intensity stays the same and we go the same number of days per week. Additionally, the overall volume should not increase more than 10% at a time. Meaning, so when you go from, hey, this week we're doing this, next week we're going to change it, the general recommendation, this is for safety and for not overdoing it with your clients, right? A 10% increase in volume is a good goal. Again, getting back to the beginning of this conversation where I went on my little soapbox about exercise prescription, this isn't necessarily for everyone. You're going to have clients where you're like, oh, I probably under prescribed exercise for you, so we're going to both increase the intensity and the duration at the same time. Is that the wrong thing to do? No. If you know your client well enough and you know their abilities, sometimes that's the absolutely right thing to do. So changing more than one at once is fine. Also increasing the volume more than 10% can be okay. So keep in mind, these are recommendations for maximum safety, and they're effective. They work. They're efficient. They're just a little bit more cautious and more for the one-size-fits-all type of prescription than it is for the individual. So how often do we progress? This is where your ability to read your client becomes important. So we want to make sure that our client can achieve certain things with the prescription that you've given them. And so they feel comfortable at the end of comfortable doing an entire session, entire week. At the end of a session, they feel fresh, like, oh, I could have probably gone another 10 minutes, or, I could go faster, like this 5 miles an hour, can we try 6 miles an hour? So if your client is getting to that phase, it's time to progress. There are thresholds that Heyward and SCSM recommend. So from going from the initial conditioning phase, so somebody who's just starting off with an exercise program, a goal for them is to achieve or complete an exercise session at 55 to 60% of their heart rate reserve for 30 minutes. Once they've done that, let's open it up and let's go to the improvement phase where we get a little more aggressive. We get into more, frequent assessments and progression prescription. So that first goal there, 55 to 60% of heart rate reserve for 30 minutes, is a threshold that both ACSM and Heyward like to follow. When we get to the improvement phase, a good rule of thumb is increase duration first. So, hey, if you have somebody, I think I use 20 minutes a day, 20 minutes a session, 3 days a week at 60% of heart rate reserve, have them go to 25 minutes a session at the same intensity, at the same frequency. And once they feel comfortable with that, you can back off duration again and then add an extra day per week, right? Or back off duration and increase intensity, right? So, but increase duration first. Get them comfortable doing what you had them do just for a longer amount of time. It's a lot safer, and that's why we do that. We don't want to increase intensity right off the bat. They might not be ready for it. Intensity is what stresses us the most. Duration, not so much. Frequency, frequency and intensity, you can only get to some so high in terms of frequency. Once you get somebody to 5 days a week, maybe 6, you can't mess with that one anymore. So it's really increase duration first, then follow with intensity. Usually when you bump up intensity, you might want to back duration off a little bit to allow them time to get used to that new intensity. You go back to increasing duration. So it's kind of this almost like a leapfrog kind of thing. Once you get to that maintenance phase, again, you're lucky if you get to that maintenance phase. Vary activities, just mess around, have fun, go out and do things that engage your clients in a meaningful and intense type of way, right? examples of modalities. You could probably come up with 1,000 other ones, but there's some good ones there. One thing that isn't discussed much, and when we start talking about cardiorespiratory fitness training and endurance, is where do high intensity intervals come in? So HIIT training, sometimes HIT, sometimes HIIT. They use that second I. HIIT training is a thing, and it's a really good thing, right? The research coming out on high intensity interval training only points to positive outcomes for all types of individuals, not just people who are fit and who can do it, but we're talking individuals with certain clinical populations. They're seeing an improvement in insulin sensitivity in individuals with diabetes or pre-diabetes when they do high-intensity interval training. It doesn't need to be long in duration, which is really nice about this type of training. 30-second sprints, you can do, depending on where they're at, but anywhere from 4 to 10 of them is an entire workout. So we're talking a total of somewhere between 2 and 5 minutes of actual exercise. It has tremendous value and it shows improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness. So even these 30-second bouts, they're pretty much purely anaerobic efforts, but they show that they do improve cardiorespiratory fitness, they improve anaerobic fitness, and they have other benefits as well, and in relationship to the health benefits of exercise. So HIIT training is a thing. Can we use it on our clients? Of course, it depends on your client. Are they ready for it? Can they handle the intensity? Is it something that's safe for them? If the answer is yes, I always recommend let's try and include a HIIT session once, maybe twice per week. This is not an everyday thing. Some people love them so much they'll do it 3 days a week. That's fine. The intensity, so the intervals of these of this type of training, there's the shorter ones. They should be at least be 30 seconds in duration. So a 30-second all-out sprint on the bike. Allow for recovery. The recovery depends on the individual. 4-minute recovery is adequate typically. In the beginning phases, sometimes 4 minutes not enough. And recovery should be active recovery, not passive. And I should have noted that because that's important. So allow a little bit of a warm-up on the bike, low intensity exercise, 40% heart rate reserve, right? Couple minutes of that, boom, do a sprint. For those of you that have done the Wingate test, it's kind of like doing a Wingate. Do that 30-second maximal bout, and then allow for active recovery. Keep pedaling, keep moving. And then after 4 minutes or longer, depending on your client, do another 30-second bout. So it's really stressful for those 30 seconds with very light pedaling in between. The active recovery in between, different than the warm-up. The active recovery in between could even be at 0 watts. Just keep the legs moving as the individual recovers. You do not want to do passive exercise. There are also what are called aerobic intervals, and the aerobic intervals are lower intensity but longer in duration. They could last anywhere 4 minutes or longer, depending on your clients, depending on their goals and their abilities and their motivation. Aerobic intervals are hard. I mean, this is like go 4 minutes. It's almost like running a mile is hard. Running a mile, you're going as hard as you can. It's kind of close to that feeling because you can't sprint the mile, but you're definitely pushing it. Kind of feels like that, right? These are 4-minute efforts. Again, recovery between them should be at least that 3 to 4 minutes, depending on your client. Probably shouldn't do as many of these, at least initially, right? And doing 2 or 3 of these to start off. But as clients get fitter and stronger, yeah, up to 5 is realistic, sometimes even more. So, yeah, HIIT training is really, really, I think it's going to become a very common and regular part of all types of cardiovascular and resistance training types of programs based on some of the results that we're seeing in the research world on how they improve not only fitness, but a lot of other disease risk factors like CHD that's on the slide here, but things like diabetes as well. So lots of good stuff from HIIT training. There are other interval types of programs, treading and spinning. And so there are these 1-to-1 or 1.5-to-1 ratios. So they can be as short as a few seconds. Hey, we're doing 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off, right? And we're going to do this for a minute, or we're going to do it for 2 minutes, right? And so we have these different sort of work to rest ratio, really intense, but also really short interval, but also really short recovery. So it's kind of, yeah, almost like a yo-yo, like, you're going really hard and then recover, really hard, recover. There's different ways of using that. I know I think, yeah, there's some benefit to doing this as well. I think from the cardiovascular and health factor, those longer intervals show a little bit more promise in terms of adaptations to them. But these types of, the treading and spinning types of intervals do have some really good performance effects, in addition to the potential for health effects. So super circuit resistance training, there are programs out there. I think Curves is one of them, where we have a situation where we're doing resistance training, but we do it continuously. So where we're doing different types of movements, it's usually equipment based, not free weights. But there's variations, right? This world, we can be creative in this world. But we're doing maybe a minute to up to 3 minutes of a station, and then of a resistance type of exercise. So let's say we do a minute of chest press. In between that, we'll do some sort of couple of minutes to 3 minutes of an aerobic activity, and then go right into the next resistance station. Again, we can vary this. You can just do all resistance stations. I've seen that. Again, the world is your oyster in terms of creativity with this, but the super circuit resistance training is fantastic. It's effective. It's efficient because sessions, usually don't go much longer than 30, 45 minutes. It's really high intensity stuff. Lots of health benefits, lots of muscular benefits, lots of cardiovascular benefits. It's all good stuff, right? We just want to get our clients exercising. So, at the end of Heyward, there's a great set of case study analyses, not analysis, but because there's multiple. And she takes you through a progression of individuals, her strategy for going over these. And the reason I present this, I want you to check this out, right? Because you're going to be, I hope, right, in some of your cases, you're going to be in this world where you get clients and you take them through stage one all the way to the end of like, hey, we're going to now start working out together. And so you sit them down, you identify some of their risks, signs and symptoms of disease. We've done all that stuff in our previous chapters. Make a note of their lifestyle factors. What kind of things do they like to do? What's their diet like? What kind of habits do they have? Do they smoke? That kind of stuff, I guess. Then you review. Now we get into some of the stuff from this chapter a little bit, right? We review their GXT results. What is their VO2 max, right? How did that GXT look? Are any crazy values in there? And then we develop a cardiorespiratory fitness plan based on what their goals are, their interests, and all that. Check that out in Heyward. It's in the Heyward text. There's some variables that you can manipulate, but I think the examples, those case studies, are fantastic. Heyward also presents some sample programs that have the full-on 15 variables within an exercise prescription. This, to me, is a fantastic way to get comfortable prescribing exercise for individuals. That being said, it's also overkill, right? I mean, we're talking, and I'm not joking, there's 15 variables. If you haven't looked yet, you should look. In this exercise prescription, everything from, we're doing heart rate, we're doing RPE, we're doing speed on the treadmill, we're doing grade on the treadmill, we're doing obviously the duration and the frequency. So we're looking at a table for an individual to go, wow, all right, this is April whatever, and this is my exercise session for the day. Oh, I'm going 30 minutes on the treadmill. This is the speed and grade I should be at. This is the heart rate I should be at. Which do I choose? If my heart rate's not in the right place at that speed and grade, do I manipulate it? But those sample programs for Heyward, I think, are fantastic. They're exceptionally thorough, but also very meaningful. So get comfortable with those. We do have a face-to-face lab session in a couple of weeks, so we can talk about some of your questions that you may have on that. So, beautiful beaches, of course, right? So that's it for this lecture. See you next time.